Welcome to this History Revision Timelines video. Today we'll be looking at Charles I's personal rule and take note of the events that forced him to recall Parliament in 1640. This revision video is mainly based on the Edexcel A-level course from 1625 to 1701, but I hope can be used for any other courses on the 17th century. As ever, if you find this video useful, please do like and subscribe. This timeline shows the main events of Charles I's personal rule. There are two main strands to follow in this timeline. Religious issues can be seen on the top, whilst financial is at the bottom. Before zooming in, it is important to note that Charles had never intended to dismantle Parliament as an institution. Many have dubbed this period the 11-year tyranny, and this can give the impression that Charles was a playboy monarch hoping to rid himself of the hassle of Parliament. This is a simplified view. Charles was a serious king with a clear vision of what he wanted to achieve. As we saw in the last video, Charles had been taken aback by Parliament's uncooperative stance. Consequently, Charles was optimistic that if he could demonstrate through a personal rule that he could realise his ambitions, he would be able to one day get Parliament back on side. So, to understand what Charles hoped to achieve, let's first look at his financial policies. In order for Charles to achieve his ambitions, he firstly had to secure his costs and ensure he had a healthy income. Now that he couldn't rely on Parliament to raise taxes, Charles had to get creative with accounting. Sensibly, Charles realised that war was expensive, so he quickly signed peace treaties with both France and Spain. This had a huge effect as it brought down military spending from £500,000 a year to £75,000 a year. The second thing Charles began to do was to reorganise the Crown's ordinary revenue. This is income that, due to medieval traditions, were technically Charles's right to collect. However, Charles hoped to maximise them. For example, he reorganised crown lands to see how much he could begin to increase rent. This included forest fines, where people whose land had encroached on royally owned forests were fined. Another example is the distraint of knighthood, where Charles unearthed a medieval rule that said he could fine anyone who owned property over £40 but who hadn't turned up for his coronation to be knighted. This raised £170,000 for Charles. Charles also stretched his interpretation of the law by continuing to collect tonnage and poundage without parliamentary consent. As mentioned, collecting taxes was Parliament's right, and this naturally caused huge upset for the ruling elite. As Charles pocketed £3 million over his personal rule period, it was anger he was prepared to live with. A policy that caused further outrage was Charles's decision to sell monopolies. This was seen as corrupt. However, the particular monopoly that caused the most consternation was Charles's decision to sell a soap monopoly to Catholics. This resurfaced deep-seated fears of Catholicism and was not helped by the quality of the soap being so poor. Indeed, it was nicknamed Popish soap and further fueled the unpopularity of Charles's new fiscal policies. Finally, possibly the most infamous of Charles's revenue-generating schemes was ship money. This was an established scheme that had long been set up in case of emergency. In order to defend coastal counties from a potential invasion, ship money was called to help bolster defences. In 1634, citing a great threat from the Spanish, Charles raised ship money and gladly pocketed £200,000. Pleased with this, Charles decided to raise ship money annually. He also decided to extend it to inland counties. This now felt like a tax, and further fueled resentment towards Charles. All in all, it must be said that Charles's money-making schemes were successful at raising revenue without Parliament's help, and whilst they certainly disgruntled people, no organised opposition formalised in this period. As Charles was securing himself financially, it freed him to pursue his ambitions for the Church of England. To Charles, part of his responsibility of being king was to help his subjects' souls get to heaven. Since Elizabethan times, the Church of England had been set up where priests and congregations were given some freedoms on how to worship. Charles wanted to address this, as in its current model he couldn't be sure that all his subjects were worshipping correctly for their souls to go to heaven. He therefore opted for religious conformity on an Arminian model. Arminianism was a form of Protestantism that was very close in practice to the Catholic worship. The fact that Charles appeared to favour Arminianism, had married a Catholic, and had granted soap monopoly to Catholics triggered fears of Catholicism that many in Parliament held. Charles was not deterred though, and made an Arminian, William Laud, Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633. This effectively allowed him to govern the Church of England. Laud wasted no time using bishops to make the changes he and Charles were after. This policy was known as the Beauty of Holiness. Together, Charles and Laud oversaw the ejection of Puritan priests, the decoration of churches, including the communion tables that now look like Catholic altars, especially as they were placed in the east of the church, the installation of organs, and vestments given to the priests. All these changes angered Puritans, especially when their funding group, the Fees of Impropriations, were stopped by Laud. Laud then angered Puritans further by issuing the Book of Sport, which allowed people to drink, dance, and play games on Sunday. This was a big no-no for Puritans who believed Sunday was just about prayer. In short, Charles and Laud were able to implement their reforms with relative success. Whilst Puritans made some noises, the majority of the country appeared to accept these changes. Even in high-profile cases, such as when Puritan writers Burton, Bastwick and Prynne continued to criticise the changes, Laud was able to swiftly silence them by using the Star Chamber to cut off their ears, brand them and leave them in pillories. It would seem then that by 1637 Charles's decision to rule without Parliament was paying off. He had established financial security whilst being able to implement the religious forms he felt were so necessary. All of this without facing any opposition deemed noteworthy. However, as we know, Charles's personal rule came to an end in 1640, when he had no choice but to summon Parliament again. In this final section of the timeline, we will look at how Charles went from a seemingly position of strength to frailty within 3 years. To begin, in 1637 Charles reissued ship money for the 4th time. Whilst it was still generating much needed revenue for Charles, there were signs that its continued collection was causing agitation. Indeed, when Charles once again issued the collection of ship money in 1638, opposition had begun to gather momentum. Between 1637 and 1638, a prominent Puritan politician called John Hampden refused to pay 20 shillings of ship money. He was subsequently taken to court, where he argued that only Parliament had the right to collect a tax. It was a much publicised trial which the king only narrowly won. This in itself would prove significant, as it became a rallying point for future dissent over the collection of ship money. Back to 1637, Charles also went too far when he introduced an English prayer book in Scotland. As you may remember from the last video, Scotland had its own separate Reformation from England and the strand of Protestantism it practised. Presbyterianism was much closer to the Puritan side of the spectrum. Subsequently, Charles's attempt to change the Scottish Church so that it adhered more closely with the English Church did not go down well. Indeed, the people of Edinburgh rioted outside St Giles's Cathedral, and Jenny Geddes apparently threw a stool at the priest reading from the prayer book. All in all, the Scottish people did not take well to the interference in their church, and the nobility and clergy signed the National Covenant, vowing to do all they could to protect Presbyterianism. Charles, clearly unaware of the strength of opposition, continued his attempts to impose the English prayer book in Scotland, so the National Covenant had no choice but to prepare for war. War was exactly what Charles had to avoid, and the timing of what became known as the First Bishops' War could not have been worse. As we have previously seen, Charles was exhausting the country's willingness to pay ship money, and in 1639 there was a taxpayers' strike. This, alongside the fact that many in England sympathised with the Scottish cause, meant that Charles's ability to prepare for war was severely hampered. As a result, Charles was forced to sign a truce at the Treaty of Berwick. The truce was only ever intended to buy Charles time, as he worked out how to fund an army capable of defeating the Scots. His only resort was to call back Parliament in 1640 and end his personal rule. I do hope this video has proved useful in giving you a basic overview. Please do use the revision worksheet on the information tab, and do please like and subscribe. Bye for now.